Okay, so when we were talking about the 1970s, we talked about how we saw a trend where things started to become more conservative. Reagan will continue that. Okay, in the 1970s, when you have Nixon as president, he is very conservative. He's very right wing. That would, like I said, continue into the 1980s. In 1980, Ronald Reagan becomes president. He is ridiculously popular with the American people. Okay, he presents ideas that are very conservative in a way that people openly support, that people love to follow, that people agree with. He is very anti-communist. He dramatically increases the budget of the military. He defines a new and confident America, one that is very, very different from the uneasiness of the 1970s. All of the turmoil of the Cold War, you'll see, will come to an end. All of the issues with regards to gas rationing will come to an end. Unfortunately, his actions will come at great cost. The rich will continue to get richer, and the poor will get much, much poorer. Now, Reagan's economic plan has three key parts. A massive tax cut, particularly for the wealthy. He cuts spending on government programs, but not the popular ones like we'll talk about. And he increases military spending. Okay, so the first thing is a tax cut, 25% over the period of 3 years. The idea is that if more people have more money, they'll invest it, giving the government more money for social programs. Okay, this will in turn trickle down to the lower classes in the form of more jobs, better social resources, improvements to their communities, things like that. This is something we call supply side economics. And there it is. Supply side economics is this idea that if you cut taxes for the wealthy, the benefits will trickle down to the lower classes. It is also called Reaganomics because it is something he pioneered. Okay, so the idea is if you cut taxes for the rich, they will take the money that they have saved and use it to make things better. Okay, similarly to what Henry Ford did when we talked about him, and how he would make sure that his employees could also be consumers. That was the theory, right? If we let the wealthy have a little bit more money, they'll take that money and they'll try to make things better for everybody. The problem is that what happened with Reagan's plan is that he cut the taxes for the wealthy, they just kept the money for themselves. Okay, they didn't reinvest it, they almost hoarded it, okay, and they didn't improve society. It never actually trickled down. The second element of the policy was to cut government spending on programs, but not popular ones like Social Security. He would cut programs that were targeted towards lower classes, that were targeted towards minorities, things like that. He did not cut social programs that were incredibly popular like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, things like that. The other component of it, like I said, was a massive increase in military spending, $1.2 trillion in 5 years. Okay, that was really the only good thing that happened with our economy. When the budget of the military increases, they can then use that money to create contracting jobs. They can use that to promote the production of war materials, which will then create more jobs in and of itself. So you get a little bit of an economic recovery to that end, which allows him to get reelected in 1984. Okay, Reagan is a big fan of removing the government from business. He deregulated airlines. He loosens restrictions on air pollution and motor vehicle safety features. There's a reason why airbags weren't so popular until much, much later, right? If Reagan hadn't reduced those restrictions, airbags would have been common in cars ages ago. Lane assist, like we have today, would have been common ages ago, right? Because you would have had this trend of increasing safety features. That would have been something promoted by the government. But under Reagan, you have 8 years, and then under George Bush Sr., 4 more years of deregulation, of government getting out of the business world. Okay. Reagan did have a long-term impact, especially on the Supreme Court. He nominated several conservative justices, including Chief Justice William Rehnquist. He was one of Reagan's appointees. He is no longer the Chief Justice, but he was one of Reagan's appointees. He also nominated a few other justices. Anthony Kennedy, who is still on the Supreme Court. Antonin Scalia, who recently passed away. He is the one whose seat is still empty, that President Obama has not name someone because he knows that Congress will sort of argue with him and not go through the process of confirming him. And Sandra Day O'Connor. Now, Sandra Day O'Connor resigned not too long ago. Some of these justices, especially Sandra Day O'Connor, would prove to be a bit more liberal than Reagan expected, but the court was still very conservative at this point in our history. Now, Reagan takes a hard line on foreign policy, especially with regards to communism. He is very active. He is very interventionist. He calls the Soviet Union an evil empire. He wants to see the reunification of Berlin and Germany. He increases the number of American weapons, which reignites the arms race. Even when the leader of the Soviet Union, Yuri Andropov, wants to reduce the number of missiles, Reagan completely ignores his request. He also develops a new plan for dealing with missiles. It's called the Strategic Defense Initiative. It's a plan that would involve destroying missiles, destroying nuclear weapons, before or after they are launched by zapping them from space, from outer space. Critics called the program Star Wars. Reagan took a lot of flack for this one, and there's a lot of evidence that this may have been around the time when he started to really experience the mental side effects of Alzheimer's, which would be what kills him. So there's a lot of controversy over this plan. It does seem a little crazy, especially given the time period. He literally wanted to use, satellites and lasers to destroy weapons, which is kind of insane. But it was a plan. It didn't actually get off the ground, obviously. But Reagan knows that the Soviet Union could not compete with the United States. We are rapidly developing. They are rapidly declining. He starts to take advantage of it. He sees cracks in the Soviet Union, especially with regards to their leadership. In Reagan's second term, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes leader of the Soviet Union. He believes in a new system of reform, one that would solve the problems between the Soviet Union and the United States. And there's a word that we use to describe this. Perestroika. It is the Russian word for reform, and it describes the new relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States throughout the 1980s. Together, Gorbachev and Reagan would address a number of long-standing problems. They would work to eliminate thousands of intermediate-range missiles in what is called the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty. We would also see the removal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan, which demonstrates the Soviet Union's willingness to stop communism from spreading. Now, that one is kind of interesting because when the Soviet troops were removed, the Mujahideen, which we talked about in the last chapter, would take control. And their lack of success in that area would allow a new group to emerge, the Taliban. And we know what happens with that story, and we'll talk about that in a few chapters as well. As tension with the Soviet Union cools, it heats up with regards to the Middle East. Lebanon, you can see it's the white country, sort of right in the middle on the border of the Mediterranean Sea. Lebanon was involved in a civil war between Muslims and Christians since 1975. Armies from Syria, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and Israel all send in troops to help their respective side of the conflict. To support Israel, we send peacekeeping forces to Lebanon in August of 1982. We have this long history of getting involved in conflicts in foreign countries. We saw that with Korea, we saw that with Vietnam, we see it today with Iraq and Afghanistan, and we did the same thing in Lebanon in the 1980s. The terrorist group, we call them terrorists, called Hezbollah. They were based in Lebanon. They kidnapped American missionaries. They felt we had no business getting involved in their country. This was a civil matter. This was something strictly limited to their borders. It did not matter to the United States. It should not matter to the United States, according to them. In October of 1983, Hezbollah forces attacked the barracks of American peacekeepers in Beirut, the capital. 241 Marines were killed by one suicide bomber with a truck full of explosives. We think this is a new thing, right? We think this is new where suicide bombers go after us because we get involved in their country. It's absolutely not. It is something we saw in Korea. It is something we saw in Vietnam. It is something we see in Lebanon. It is something we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's all over the place. This is not a new thing. When we talked in the beginning of the semester about history repeating itself, boom, there it is. Okay, so the roots of what we see today they really start to grow in the 1980s. Okay, so, you know, it's not all that long ago, 30 years, but it still plays a critical role in today's society. Now, another country that we face an issue with, although a far less violent issue, is Japan. Okay, Japan becomes the first fully modernized non-Western nation. Okay, fully modernized non-Western nation. They became that way in the 1940s. We suffer what is called a trade deficit with Japan in the 1980s. And a trade deficit is basically when we export less to a country than we import from them. In other words, we buy more from them than they buy from us. Okay? It is an imbalance in our trade. We are buying more from Japan than they are buying from us. We are giving them more of our money than they are giving their money to us. Okay? Imports from a country are more than the amount of exports to that country. Okay, Japan is exporting things like car, steel, consumer products, technology. I mean, tons and tons and tons of technology in the 1980s originated from Japan. In the 1950s, Japan realized we don't have a whole lot of natural resources. What do we have? People, right? And with all of this people, we have all of this intelligence. We can use that to create things, and that's exactly what they did. Okay. In response to the trade deficit, the government places import tariffs on Japanese goods, but it really doesn't make that much of a difference. We simply aren't producing the same types of things that they are, and people will continue to buy their products. So we have a great foreign dependency on oil. We have a trade deficit with Japan. We are being attacked by terrorist groups in the Middle East. Are we really still a global superpower? And that was really a big question in the 1980s. It was really a big concern of Reagan's as to whether or not we were still sort of master and commander of the world when we were facing all of these obstacles. Domestically, Americans find themselves divided on a number of different factors, socially, politically, economically. The rich are getting rich, the poor are getting poorer, especially with regards to minorities. Reagan's tax cuts absolutely favor the wealthy. The number of billionaires grows from just 1 in 1978 to almost 50 in 1987, so less than 10 years. The number of Americans that earn more than $500,000 annually grew tenfold. The number of people living below the poverty line increases. Minorities are hit especially hard. Cities are facing unique problems. We talked about this last time. In the 1950s and into the 1960s, people were moving out of cities and into the suburbs. If they move, they take their tax dollars with them. So cities experienced a great decline in revenue in the 70s and into the 80s. Okay, drug use spreads dramatically, especially because of the growth and popularity of crack cocaine. Gang violence skyrockets. You see a lot of young people in inner cities turning to gang violence, turning to gang membership as a source of identity and security. Prison sentences for drug possession and drug use increase. This is where you really start to see a huge overrepresentation of minorities from urban areas in the prison system. Okay, the federal government does try to address some of these issues. First Lady Nancy Reagan responds by spearheading the Just Say No campaign, because that was super successful. Nancy Reagan, as First Lady, we see this with all of our First Ladies. They all try to take charge of some social program. With Michelle Obama, it was the idea of healthy lunches and making sure children are eating healthy and getting exercise and things like that. With First Lady Hillary Clinton, it was healthcare, especially for children. With Nancy Reagan, it was an anti-drug campaign. Okay. What we see in the 1980s, as well as all of these divides, and as a result of all of these divides, are culture wars, okay, conflicts between various cultures within our country. The new right, led by the religious or highly conservative, clashes with liberals. People on the far right, like Rush Limbaugh, protest sexual expression on TV, what is considered lewd in the media. The decline of the educational system, reproductive freedoms that we see from Roe v. Wade in the 1970s. He protests against things like that, he and his followers in the 1980s. Liberals respond to this by creating a group called People for the American Way. This group was designed to combat the highly conservative groups of the New Right. Together with the American Civil Liberties Union, the New Right were met with conflict every single step of the way, something we still see to this very day. Because much of the conflict takes place in the cultural realm, TV, movies, music, we call them the culture wars, and we still see that today, right? When you have people protesting a football player's right to take a knee during the national anthem, right? That is a cultural issue. That is the symbolic action of someone who is a cultural celebrity for all intents and purposes. These things still exist very heavily in our society today. Another social crisis divides society: AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, a deadly disease that attacks the immune system. As we know, it is transmitted through bodily fluids. It compromises the immune system. It leaves the body susceptible to a host of other diseases. It is first detected in 1981, but by 1988, over 57,000 cases were diagnosed, and countless others were undiagnosed. It originally appeared in gay men, and many say that is the reason why politicians were very slow to respond. There was no desire to sort of help that community. Gradually, it spreads well beyond the homosexual community, and really, it's because of the popularity of people like Freddie Mercury, lead singer of Queen, or Magic Johnson, that you really see AIDS moving into the forefront of American society, and people sort of waking up and saying, okay, wait a minute, maybe we should do something about this. It is now a disease that affects everyone, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation. There are some studies that say that young females between 18 and 34 are the most at-risk population for HIV and subsequently AIDS. Safe sex education. Increased awareness programs are implemented to combat the spread of the disease. Though significant progress has been made, it still remains a critical issue in American society. It has, of course, sort of dropped in popularity in recent years, but it is still a very critical issue. World AIDS Day is actually coming up. I believe it is December 1st, if I'm not mistaken. 1988 rolls around. Reagan can't run again, obviously, 2 terms and done. So he supports his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, George H.W. Bush. This is one of those times in American history where you cannot just use the last name of a person. There are 2 President Bushes. You must designate which one you mean. You can say H.W. Bush, you can say George W. Bush for his son, you can say Bush Sr., you can say Bush Jr., you can say Bush the dad, you can say Bush the son. I really don't care how you do it, but you have to differentiate between the 2. He wins the election of '88, and all he really does is follow in the footsteps of Reagan before him. He is not nearly as popular, and neither are his politics. Reagan's presidency, his increase in military spending, his reduction in taxes, all of this results in an enormous national debt. By 1990, it was clear that George H.W. Bush could not abide by Reagan's tax policies, despite the fact that he said no new taxes. He makes the very difficult choice to raise taxes, to cut military spending. He needs to address the deficit. He needs to address the looming and growing debt of the United States. And that will ultimately cost him re-election. There is a recession looming. Unemployment has risen to 7%. Companies are beginning to downsize. The number of impoverished Americans is increasing dramatically. One thing Bush is very good at in the late 1980s is handling foreign issues. He continues to take advantage of the idea of perestroika and of Gorbachev's various changes in the Soviet Union. Countries throughout Eastern Europe begin to cast off communism. This is the Soviet Union when George H.W. Bush becomes president. In 1989, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania all get rid of their communist governments. In 1990, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia declare independence. So much so that by 1991, that's the map. The Soviet Union has collapsed into a number of independent states, Russia, of course, being the largest. In November of 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down. This is Checkpoint Charlie. This is the crossing between West and East Germany in Berlin. That is on top of the Berlin Wall. That is the Brandenburg Gate. It is just outside of that gate that Reagan did the whole Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall speech. This was monumental, right? To imagine that these people had been divided from who were essentially their neighbors for almost 30 years, it's incredible. You know, we don't think of much when we think of the Berlin Wall, but to imagine that it literally divided an entire city, this was monumental. It was a party. It was an absolute celebration that day, because we knew as a world that the Soviet Union was crumbling. This was very, very symbolic of the destruction of the Soviet Union. The United States won the Cold War. Okay, more definitively, the Soviet Union lost it, but we claimed victory. The idea of containment had worked. We kept communism from taking over the world, but really it did collapse from within. It's not as though American forces wiped out communism. It's that communism could not sustain itself. So it was not necessarily our war to win, but the Soviets' war to lose. But we did claim victory. The positive results of the end of the Cold War include a reduction of nuclear weapons and the spread of democracy through a variety of countries. The negative results, however, were very harsh. In these new countries, these newly independent countries, you have conflict emerging as people compete for power. A new tactic in this competition for power emerges. It is called ethnic cleansing. It is what we refer to, it is the term we use to refer to removing people from an area. And that can be quite literally forcing them out, kind of like what we did to Native Americans during the Trail of Tears, quite literally forcing them to leave, or exterminating them, like you see here. This famously took place in the country of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was part of the former Yugoslavia. And it would happen all around the world. It still does happen all around the world. This is what Saddam Hussein did to the ethnic Kurds in northern Iraq when he used poison gas against them. It is when you target a specific ethnic group with the sole purpose of removing them in one way or another. Other foreign issues emerge around the world. Spontaneous democratic rallies appear in China in June of 1989 in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. The communist government will use force to break up the rallies, killing several hundred student activists. This picture is very famous from the rallies. He is called Tank Man. Nobody knows who he is, but there is this iconic picture of him just carrying some bags home from work, from the store, from wherever, just standing in protest against these tanks. Someone did eventually sort of run from the side, grab him, and whisk him away, another bystander, but it is nevertheless an incredibly iconic image. The way that the Chinese government treated these democratic rallies would cause a little bit of tension between the United States and China. It became pretty clear that while China might be willing to compromise in some areas, like economic policies, they were still quite willing to use brute force against any political movements against them. Most importantly was the Middle East again. In 1988, a war between Iran and Iraq sees no clear winner. In 1990, Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, invades the country of Kuwait in an attempt to gain political strength in the region. He also wants to alleviate some of the financial problems that he still had as a result of the war with Iran. George H.W. Bush was very afraid that this might threaten our oil supply. He works with several other nations, establishes an embargo against Iraq, basically cuts them off from all foreign supplies. Saddam Hussein does not back down. He allows the embargo to continue, and he furthers his invasion of Kuwait. And in January of 1991, the Persian Gulf War begins. Saddam Hussein's attempts failed. Absolutely failed. U.S. anti-ballistic missiles were used to wipe out Iraqi forces. When ground combat actually begins in February of 1991, it is over in a matter of days. 40,000 Iraqis are killed in this conflict. Only 240 troops from the combined allied forces with a variety of United Nations countries will perish. So we had very, very few losses in that one. Hussein gives up Kuwait, but Bush does not invade Iraq, leading the area very volatile, very unstable, and he will remain in power for many, many years. We will talk about him a little bit more in the coming chapters. Now, by the time everything is said and done, George W. Bush is declining in popularity. Okay, he was never as popular as Reagan. His economic policies were largely catastrophic. His approval rating drops dramatically. So much so that by 1992, people generally understand that we need a change, one that would be marked by a Democrat in office, Bill Clinton. With the election of 1992, we see power switching over to the blue side. Republicans are out of power now. Democrats are back in power. He's much younger. He represents a new generation. He sees now, the whole country sees now, that politics will no longer be communism versus democracy. It will now be left versus right. And Bill Clinton's election in 1992 really demonstrates that, because he was a very middle-of-the-road candidate. He was what we call a centrist, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. What we see with his election is the start of a new era, socially, politically, and economically. And that is what we will look at next.